Abandoned in the freezing snow with 4 puppies, she lowers her head, hoping for mercy, discovery in the snow. The biting wind howled like a banshee, whipping across the desolate stretch of Highway 80, somewhere between Elko and Winnemucca, Nevada. John Miller, a veteran trucker with a grizzled beard and weary eyes, gripped the steering wheel of his rig, his knuckles white against the worn leather. The snow was coming down thick and fast now, blurring the already fading light of the late afternoon. He squinted through the swirling flakes, his headlights barely piercing the white veil that enveloped the road. John was bone-tired. 3 days on the road, hauling a load of electronics from California to Chicago, and he was itching to get home to his empty house in Omaha. He'd been making this run for over 20 years, ever since he'd left the army, and usually, the solitude of the open road was a comfort. But lately, the silence had become a heavy presence, a constant reminder of the emptiness that had settled over his life since Mary, his wife, had passed away a year ago. He sighed, the sound lost in the roar of the engine and the relentless wind. Mary had always been his anchor, his rock. She was the one who'd encouraged him to buy his first truck, the one who'd kept the home fires burning while he was away, the one who'd always been there with a warm smile and a hot meal when he returned. Now, the house felt cold and lifeless, and the meals were prepackaged and tasteless. He was about to reach for the CB radio, hoping to catch some chatter and break the monotony, when a flicker of movement by the side of the road caught his eye. He slowed down, peering through the snow-covered windshield. At first, he thought it was just a pile of discarded trash, something the wind had blown off a passing vehicle. But as he got closer, he realized with a jolt that it was a dog, a small, brown and white creature huddled against the snowbank, shivering uncontrollably. John hesitated. He wasn't a dog person, never had been. Mary had always wanted one, but he'd resisted. Too much responsibility, he'd argued. Too messy. Too much like having a child. Now, looking at the pathetic creature by the roadside, he felt a pang of guilt. He couldn't just leave it there to freeze to death. He pulled the truck over to the shoulder, the engine groaning in protest as he shifted into park. He grabbed his heavy parka from the passenger seat and stepped out into the biting wind. The snow crunched under his boots as he approached the dog cautiously. It whimpered softly, its tail tucked between its legs, its eyes wide with fear. "Hey there, fella," John said softly, his voice rough from disuse. "It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt ya." He knelt down in the snow, holding out his hand slowly. The dog flinched but didn't run. John inched closer, letting the dog sniff his hand. It was a female, he realized, and she was skin and bones, her ribs showing through her thin coat. He could feel her trembling through his gloves. "You're in a bad way, aren't you?" he murmured. He looked around, wondering how she'd ended up here, in the middle of nowhere, in this weather. There was no sign of another vehicle, no footprints in the snow. It was as if she'd just materialized out of thin air. He reached out and gently stroked her head. She leaned into his touch, a low growl rumbling in her throat. He noticed a collar around her neck, but it was too dark to make out any details. He felt a sudden surge of pity for the creature. She was probably someone's pet, lost and alone. He remembered Mary's words, spoken years ago when he'd found a stray cat on their doorstep. "Sometimes, John," she'd said, her voice soft and gentle, "angels come in unexpected forms." He looked at the dog, her eyes pleading with him. Maybe Mary was right. Maybe this was his chance to do something good, to make up for all the times he'd been too stubborn, too set in his ways. "Come on, girl," he said, scooping her up into his arms. She was surprisingly light, almost weightless. "Let's get you out of this cold." As he carried her back to the truck, he noticed something else in the snowbank. He carefully gathered them up, one by one, tucking them inside his parka. They were whimpering softly, their tiny bodies shivering. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he'd held his own son in his arms for the first time all those years ago. He climbed back into the truck, the dog nestled in his lap, He didn't know where he was going to take her, or what he was going to do with her and her pups. But one thing was certain. He couldn't leave them to die in the freezing snow. The heater in John's truck was struggling to combat the icy chill that had seeped into its very bones. He cranked it up another notch, wincing as a blast of lukewarm air hit his face. It would have to do. He glanced down at the dog nestled in his lap. She was still shivering, but her breathing seemed a little stronger now. He gently stroked her fur, feeling the sharp bones beneath her matted coat. He couldn't imagine how long she'd been out there in the cold, or how she'd even managed to survive. He reached into his bag and pulled out a thermos of coffee, taking a long swig of the bitter liquid. It warmed him from the inside out, chasing away some of the chill that had settled in his bones. He offered some to the dog, holding the thermos to her lips. She lapped at it hesitantly at first, then with increasing eagerness. "Good girl," he murmured, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed having something to care for, something to focus on besides his own loneliness. He glanced at the puppies nestled in his parka. They were sleeping soundly now, their tiny bodies curled up together. He counted them 1, 2, 3, 4. For little lives that he'd saved from certain death. He felt a strange sense of responsibility for them, a feeling that was both daunting and exhilarating. He knew he couldn't keep them. He was a trucker, for crying out loud. He lived on the road, but he couldn't just abandon them either. He'd have to find them a good home, somewhere they'd be safe and loved. He thought about calling the nearest animal shelter, but something held him back. He'd heard stories about overcrowded shelters, about animals being euthanized because there wasn't enough space. He couldn't bear the thought of these little ones ending up like that. He decided to keep them with him for now, at least until he could figure out what to do with them. He reached into his bag again and pulled out a spare blanket, carefully wrapping it around the puppies. He then turned his attention to the mother dog, gently examining her. He noticed a small, faded tattoo on the inside of her ear. He squinted, trying to make out the letters. GPL, he read aloud. What did that stand for? He reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. He had to find a place to stop, somewhere warm and safe. He scrolled through his contacts, looking for the number of a motel he'd stayed at before, a place just off the highway a few miles back. He found it and pressed the call button. The phone rang a couple of times before a gruff voice answered. Motel 6, Reno. What can I do for you? Hi, John said, his voice hoarse. I'm a trucker, and I've got a bit of an emergency. I found a dog and her puppies abandoned by the side of the road. They're freezing. Do you have any vacancies? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Dogs, huh? We don't usually allow pets. I understand, John said, his voice pleading. But these animals are in bad shape. They won't be any trouble. I'll keep them in my truck most of the time. I just need a place to warm up and get them out of the cold. Another pause, then a sigh. All right. I got a room in the back. Number 10. But keep those critters quiet, you hear? You got it, John said, relief flooding through him. Thank you. I really appreciate it. He hung up and smiled at the dog. Looks like we're in luck, girl, he said. We've got a place to stay for the night. He turned the truck around, heading back towards Reno. As he drove, he couldn't help but wonder about the dog and her puppies. Where had they come from? Who would abandon them like that in the middle of nowhere in this weather? And what did those letters on her ear mean? He had a feeling this was just the beginning of a very unexpected journey. The Motel 6 was a bleak, low-slung building bathed in the sickly yellow glow of sodium lamps. It looked like the kind of place where dreams went to die. John thought grimly as he pulled his rig into the parking lot. He was grateful for the shelter, but the place reeked of stale cigarettes and despair. He hoped it was clean enough for the pups. He scooped up the bundle of blankets containing the puppies, careful not to wake them. Lucy stirred in his arms, her tail giving a tentative thump against his chest. Easy girl, he murmured. We're almost there. Room 10 was at the back, as promised, away from the flickering neon sign that advertised vacancy to the passing traffic. The key? a heavy brass affair attached to a chipped plastic fob, stuck in the lock at first, but with a bit of jiggling and a muttered curse, John managed to wrestle it open. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a double bed, a battered dresser, and a chair that looked like it had seen better days. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, barely masking the underlying odor of mildew. John wrinkled his nose, but there was no time to be picky. He laid the puppies down gently on the bed, then turned his attention to Lucy. She was hesitant to enter the room, her tail tucked between her legs, her eyes darting nervously around. John knelt down and patted the floor encouragingly. "Come on, girl," he said softly. "It's okay. We're safe here." After a moment's hesitation, Lucy crept into the room, her nose twitching, her body still tense. John closed the door behind her, shutting out the cold and the darkness. He switched on the bedside lamp, casting a dim glow over the room. He watched as Lucy cautiously explored her new surroundings. She sniffed at the bed, the chair, the worn carpet. She circled the room a couple of times, then finally settled down on the bed next to the puppies. She gave a deep sigh, her body relaxing for the first time since John had found her. John felt a wave of sympathy for the weary creature. He couldn't imagine what she'd been through, but it was clear she was exhausted and traumatized. He decided to leave her alone for a while, to let her rest and regain her strength. He went to the bathroom and splashed some water on his face, trying to wash away the grime of the road. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. His eyes were bloodshot, his face creased with fatigue. He looked every one of his 50 years. He hadn't been taking care of himself lately, letting his grief consume him. Maybe this unexpected detour was just what he needed, a chance to focus on something other than his own pain. He went back to the main room and found Lucy curled up around her puppies, her eyes closed. He smiled. They looked so peaceful, so content. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. He pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down, watching them sleep. He wondered what their story was. Where had they come from? Who had abandoned them so cruelly? And what was he going to do with them? He knew he couldn't keep them. He was a trucker, for crying out loud. His life was on the road, but he couldn't just abandon them either. He had to find them a good home, somewhere they'd be safe and loved. He thought about calling the nearest animal shelter, but the image of those overcrowded cages, those sad, pleading eyes, made him hesitate. He couldn't bear the thought of these little ones ending up like that. He decided to keep them with him for now, at least until he could figure out what to do with them. He reached into his bag and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. He needed to find a vet, someone who could check them over, make sure they were healthy. He found a 24-hour animal clinic in Reno and pressed the call button. A woman with a kind voice answered. John explained the situation, his voice rough with emotion. The woman listened patiently, then gave him directions to the clinic. "Bring them in as soon as you can," she said. "We'll take good care of them." John thanked her and hung up. He looked at Lucy and her puppies, a sense of purpose settling over him. He was going to do everything he could to help them. He owed it to them, and maybe, just maybe, they would help him too. The Reno Animal Clinic was a haven of warmth and soft lighting compared to the desolate chill of the motel room. John, with Lucy cautiously trailing behind him and the puppies bundled securely in his parka, was greeted by a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "You must be Mr. Miller," she said, her voice soothing. "I'm Emily. We've been expecting you." He followed Emily through a brightly lit waiting area, past rows of anxious cats in carriers and a boisterous Labrador puppy straining at its leash. The air hummed with a low buzz of worried whispers and the occasional whimper. Lucy, initially hesitant, seemed to relax slightly at the familiar scents and sounds of other dogs. Emily led them to a small examination room, its walls lined with posters of contented cats and playful dogs. "Let's get them settled," she said, gesturing towards a padded examination table. John gently placed the puppies on the table, unwrapping them from their blanket cocoon. They blinked in the light, their tiny bodies still trembling slightly. Lucy, however, remained by the door, her tail tucked, her eyes wary. "She's been through a lot," John explained. "She's still a bit skittish." Emily nodded understandingly. "That's perfectly normal. We'll give her some space." She knelt down, speaking to Lucy in a soft, reassuring voice. "It's all right, sweetheart. We're here to help." Dr. Anderson, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense air and a stethoscope slung around her neck, entered the room. She gave John a brisk nod. "Mr. Miller, I understand you found these little ones in a rather unfortunate situation." John recounted the events of the previous night, the discovery on the highway, the freezing cold, the puppies huddled in the snow. Dr. Anderson listened intently, her brow furrowed. She then proceeded to examine the puppies one by one, checking their hearts, their lungs, their reflexes. "They're severely malnourished and dehydrated," she concluded, her voice grave. "The smallest one, in particular, is very weak. He's going to need some extra care." John felt a pang of worry. "Will they be all right?" "We'll do everything we can," Dr. Anderson assured him. "They're fighters, these little ones, but they've had a rough start." She turned her attention to Lucy, who was now allowing Emily to stroke her head. "And the mother?" John asked. Dr. Anderson's expression hardened as she examined Lucy. "She's showing signs of severe neglect," she said, her voice tight. "Her coat is matted, her teeth are in poor condition, and she has some old scars that suggest she may have been abused." John felt a surge of anger. Who could do such a thing to these helpless creatures? He noticed the tattoo on Lucy's ear again, the letters GPL. He pointed it out to Dr. Anderson. "Do you know what that means?" Dr. Anderson examined the tattoo closely. "GPL," she repeated, her voice grim. "I've seen this before. Could stand for Paws Labs. They're a notorious puppy mill operating somewhere in this region. They're known for their inhumane conditions and their disregard for animal welfare." John felt a chill run down his spine. Puppy mill. He'd heard of them. Places where dogs were treated like breeding machines, kept in cramped cages, denied proper care and affection. The thought of Lucy and her puppies being subjected to such cruelty made his blood boil. "We need to report this," he said, his voice firm. "These people need to be stopped." Dr. Anderson nodded. "I agree. I'll contact the authorities. In the meantime, we'll take good care of Lucy and her pups." John felt a surge of gratitude for the veterinarian and her staff. He knew he'd found the right place for them. He spent the rest of the morning at the clinic, watching as the puppies were fed and hydrated, and Lucy was given a warm bath and a much-needed grooming. He felt a growing connection to these animals, a sense of responsibility for their well-being. As he left the clinic, Dr. Anderson handed him a card. "Call me if you have any questions," she said. "And Mr. Miller," she added, her voice softening, "thank you for what you did. You saved their lives." John nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He wasn't sure who was saving whom. He climbed back into his truck, his heart heavy with the knowledge of the cruelty that existed in the world, but also lighter with the hope that he could make a difference, even if it was just for these 5 little lives. He had a long road ahead of him, but he knew he wasn't alone anymore. He had Lucy and her puppies, and they had him. The highway stretched out before him like an endless gray ribbon, winding its way through the snow-dusted landscape. John, his hands firmly gripping the wheel, felt a familiar sense of calm settle over him as he merged back into the flow of traffic. The steady hum of the engine, the rhythmic whoosh of the tires against the asphalt, the ever-changing scenery outside his window, these were the things that had always brought him peace. But today, there was something different. He wasn't alone anymore. In the sleeper cab behind him, Lucy and her puppies were curled up in a makeshift nest of blankets and pillows. He'd stopped at a Walmart on the way out of Reno, stocking up on puppy food, a couple of chew toys, and a collapsible crate. He'd never thought he'd be buying puppy supplies, but here he was, a 50-year-old trucker turned accidental dog dad. He smiled to himself, picturing the 4 furry bundles snuggled together, their tiny paws twitching in their sleep. He'd named them after his favorite jazz musicians. Charlie, the biggest and most boisterous, a golden retriever mix with a mischievous glint in his eyes. Miles, the quiet observer, a black lab mix with soulful brown eyes. Ella, the graceful one, a sleek border collie mix with a playful spirit. And Ben, the smallest and most fragile, a terrier mix with a heart-wrenching vulnerability. He'd already grown attached to them, each with their own distinct personalities. And Lucy, despite her initial wariness, was slowly starting to trust him. She would now meet his gaze with a hesitant wag of her tail, and she would lean against his leg when he sat beside her in the cab. He knew it would take time for her to fully heal from the trauma she'd endured, but he was determined to give her the love and care she deserved. He thought about the puppy mill Paws Labs. Dr. Anderson had assured him that the authorities were investigating, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more. Those people needed to be brought to justice. He couldn't bear the thought of other animals suffering the way Lucy and her pups had. He reached for the CB radio, his fingers hovering over the button. He hadn't used it much lately, preferring the silence of his own thoughts. But now he felt a need to connect, to share his story, to see if anyone else out there knew anything about Paws Labs. Breaker, this is Big John, he said, his voice booming through the speakers. Anyone out there got any info on a place called Paws Labs? Over. There was a crackle of static. Then a gruff voice responded. Paws, huh? Yeah, I heard of them. Shady operation. They run a bunch of puppy mills in this part of the country. Bad news, those folks. Over. John felt a surge of anger. You know where they're located? He asked, his voice tight. Nope, they keep a low profile. But I heard they got connections all over. Real nasty bunch. You'd be better off staying out of their way. Over. John hesitated. He knew the trucker was right. He was just one man. What could he do against a powerful organization like that? But then he thought of Lucy, of her sad eyes, her trembling body. He thought of the puppies, their innocent faces, their playful spirits. He couldn't just turn a blind eye. Thanks for the warning, he said into the radio. But I can't just ignore this. These people need to be stopped. Over. There was a moment of silence. Then a different voice came on the radio. A woman's voice, clear and strong. Big John, this is Lady Liberty. I heard your call. I know something about Paws. Meet me at the Flying J truck stop in Wells, Nevada. We need to talk. Over. John felt a jolt of adrenaline. Lady Liberty. He'd heard of her. She was a legend on the CB, a trucker who fought for justice and helped those in need. He couldn't believe she'd responded to his call. Lady Liberty, this is Big John. Copy that. I'll be there. Over and out. He smiled grimly. It looked like his journey was about to take an unexpected turn. He glanced back at the sleeper cab, where Lucy was now watching him with curious eyes. Don't worry, girl. He murmured. We're gonna get those guys. I promise. The Flying J truck stop in Wells, Nevada, was a beacon of light and activity in the vast emptiness of the desert. John pulled his rig into the crowded lot, his headlights cutting through the swirling snow flurries. He scanned the rows of trucks, his eyes searching for a particular rig, one that might belong to the enigmatic Lady Liberty. He spotted it near the back, a sleek, customized Peterbilt with a distinctive eagle painted on the side. He parked his own truck nearby and climbed out, his boots crunching on the icy pavement. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. He felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. He didn't know what to expect from this meeting, but he hoped Lady Liberty could provide some answers, some direction. He approached the Peterbilt cautiously, his hand hovering over the door handle. He hesitated for a moment, then knocked firmly. The door swung open, revealing a woman with a warm smile and piercing blue eyes. She was tall and athletic, with short, silver hair and a weathered face that spoke of countless miles on the road. She wore a denim jacket over a plaid shirt, and her jeans were tucked into a pair of sturdy work boots. Big John? She asked, her voice strong and confident. That's me, John replied, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Come on in," she said, stepping aside. "It's freezing out there." John entered the cab, grateful for the warmth and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. The interior was surprisingly spacious and well-appointed, with plush leather seats, a small refrigerator, and a microwave. A laptop computer sat open on a fold-out table, displaying a map of the United States with various routes and truck stops marked. "Have a seat," Lady Liberty said, gesturing towards the passenger seat. "Can I get you some coffee?" "That would be great," John said, settling into the comfortable seat. Lady Liberty poured him a steaming mug of coffee, then took her own seat behind the wheel. "So," she said, her eyes twinkling, "you're the one who's been asking about Paws Labs." John nodded. "I found a dog and her puppies abandoned by the side of the road. They were in bad shape. The vet said they might have come from that puppy mill." Lady Liberty's expression hardened. "Those bastards," she muttered. "They've been operating for years, flying under the radar. They're well-connected, well-protected. It's hard to get any evidence against them." "But you know something?" John asked, his voice eager. Lady Liberty nodded. "I've been tracking them for a while now. I've got some information, some leads. But I need help. It's too dangerous to go up against them alone." John felt a surge of determination. "I'm in," he said without hesitation. "I can't let those people get away with what they're doing." Lady Liberty smiled. "I knew I could count on you, Big John. You've got a good heart." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a file folder, handing it to John. "Here's what I've got so far," she said. "Names, addresses, transport routes. It's not much, but it's a start." John opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents. He saw names of individuals, addresses of suspected breeding facilities, and details of truck routes used to transport the puppies. It was a complex network, carefully designed to avoid detection. "This is good stuff," John said, impressed. "But how do we use it?" Lady Liberty leaned forward, her voice low and intense. "We need to gather more evidence. We need to expose their operation. And we need to do it carefully. These people are dangerous. They won't hesitate to silence anyone who gets in their way." John felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew this was serious, but he wasn't going to back down. He owed it to Lucy and her puppies. He owed it to all the animals suffering in those puppy mills. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice steady. Lady Liberty outlined her strategy, a plan that involved covert surveillance, information gathering, and ultimately, contacting the authorities with irrefutable evidence. It was a risky plan, but it was their best shot at bringing Paws Labs down. John listened intently, his mind racing. He knew this was going to be a long and difficult road, but he was ready for the challenge. He had a purpose now, a mission. He wasn't just a trucker anymore. He was a protector, a crusader for justice. And he wouldn't rest until those responsible for animal cruelty were brought to justice. The next few days were a blur of activity. John, guided by Lady Liberty's intel and his own growing determination, embarked on a covert mission to expose Paws Labs. He juggled his trucking routes with clandestine surveillance, using his rig as a mobile observation post. He followed the leads Lady Liberty had provided, staking out suspected breeding facilities, noting license plate numbers, and logging transport schedules. He felt a thrill of adrenaline each time he closed in on one of the labs, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer just a trucker hauling cargo. He was a warrior fighting for the voiceless, a guardian angel for those who couldn't protect themselves. He would park his rig at a discreet distance, using binoculars to observe the comings and goings at the facilities. He saw shadowy figures loading crates into unmarked vans, heard the distant barking of dogs, and witnessed the furtive exchanges between workers and buyers. Each observation, each photograph he managed to capture, fueled his anger and strengthened his resolve. He kept in constant contact with Lady Liberty, sharing his findings, coordinating their efforts. She was a valuable ally, her knowledge of the trucking industry and her network of contacts proving invaluable. She helped him decipher transport codes, identify key players in the operation, and navigate the complex web of deceit that Paws Labs had woven. There were close calls, moments of heart-stopping tension when he feared he'd been spotted, when a suspicious glance or a lingering question from a worker sent a chill down his spine. But he remained calm, relying on his instincts and his years of experience on the road to blend in, to appear as just another trucker passing through. He missed his old routine, the solitude of the open road, the simple pleasure of a hot meal at a familiar diner. But he knew he couldn't turn back now. He was in too deep and the stakes were too high. He thought of Lucy and her pups, their trusting eyes, their playful antics, and he knew he couldn't let them down. One evening, while parked at a rest stop outside Salt Lake City, John received a coded message from Lady Liberty. "The Eagle has landed," it read. He knew what it meant. She had infiltrated one of the main breeding facilities, posing as a potential buyer. She was gathering crucial evidence, documenting the horrific conditions, the abused animals, the callous disregard for life. He waited anxiously for her next communication, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. Hours passed, each one stretching into an eternity. He feared the worst, imagining her discovered, captured, silenced. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, his newfound ally, his guiding light in this dark crusade. Finally, just as dawn was breaking, his CB crackled to life. "The package is secured." Lady Liberty's voice came through, a hint of urgency in her tone. "Meet me at the rendezvous point. Time is of the essence." John's heart pounded with a mix of relief and excitement. They had it, the evidence they needed to bring Paws Labs down. He started his engine, a grim smile spreading across his face. It was time to deliver justice. The rendezvous point was a desolate rest area off a lonely stretch of highway in the Nevada desert. John arrived first, his truck gleaming under the harsh midday sun. He parked at the far end of the lot, away from the few other vehicles scattered about, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. He double-checked the contents of his duffel bag. A burner phone, a small digital camera, a map with the location of the Paws Labs headquarters circled in red, and a copy of the evidence Lady Liberty had gathered. He paced restlessly beside his truck, scanning the horizon for any sign of her arrival. The wind whipped across the barren landscape, whistling through the gaps in the deserted picnic tables. The only other sound was the distant drone of a passing airplane, a lonely reminder of the vastness of the world and the enormity of the task ahead. A cloud of dust on the horizon caught his attention. A sleek, black SUV emerged from the haze, its engine growling like a predator on the hunt. John's pulse quickened. Lady Liberty. The SUV pulled up beside his truck, and Lady Liberty stepped out, her face grim, her eyes filled with a steely determination. She was dressed in black, her silver hair tucked under a baseball cap. She looked like a warrior ready for battle. "You got it?" John asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lady Liberty nodded, her expression grave. "Everything. Photos, videos, witness testimonies. Enough to bury those bastards." John felt a surge of triumph. They had done it. They had infiltrated the heart of the operation, exposed the cruelty, gathered the evidence. Now it was time to bring the hammer down. They climbed into John's truck, the cab suddenly feeling cramped with the weight of their shared secret, the burden of their mission. John started the engine, the familiar rumble a comforting sound in the tense silence. "Where to now?" he asked, his eyes meeting Lady Liberty's in the rearview mirror. "We go to the authorities," she said, her voice firm. "We hand over the evidence, and we let justice take its course." John nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He pulled out of the rest area, the truck gaining speed as they headed towards the nearest town, towards the police station, towards the end of this long and dangerous road. The drive was tense, filled with a nervous anticipation. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, replaying the events of the past few days, the risks they had taken, the horrors they had witnessed. But beneath the fear and anxiety, there was a sense of satisfaction, a knowledge that they had done the right thing, that they had fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves. As they approached the town, John felt a pang of sadness. He would miss the camaraderie he had found with Lady Liberty, the shared purpose, the adrenaline rush of their mission. But he knew this was the only way. It was time to let go, to trust that the authorities would do their job, that justice would prevail. He pulled up in front of the police station, a small, brick building that looked woefully inadequate for the task ahead. He switched off the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the pounding of his heart. Lady Liberty turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, John," she said, her voice soft. "I couldn't have done it without you." John smiled, a genuine smile that reached his weary eyes. "We did it together," he said, "and we did it for them." They stepped out of the truck, the midday sun glinting off the police station's badge. They walked towards the entrance, two unlikely heroes, a trucker and a vigilante, united by a shared cause, ready to face whatever lay ahead. They had faced danger, confronted evil, and emerged victorious. And in their wake, they left a trail of hope, a testament to the power of compassion and the unwavering spirit of those who fight for justice.